I am at the moment. Although I can't see the chat. If someone could just keep an eye on the chat for me, that would be great. Or Hayley, if you know how I can get the faces back.
So on your menu bar, where you can you should be able to see yourself with a little bar, and then above it maybe 2 other bars or 3 other bars, so it allows you to bring a crowd up.
Yeah, I'm here. So I want to be able to see my slides and see your faces. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so what I do, as Angela's already described, is help organisations have better quality conversations with not just each other or their managers or like you say, but also with their customers. So my background is in sales and marketing. So I kind of started out with the theory around communicating with customers. And then over the course of my working life, I've managed big teams, I've managed big operations. And I've kind of realised that there's an awful lot of merit in focusing on conversations with each other, conversations within your team, with your manager, with your peers, that actually can make such a big difference to the success of an organisation. My business is called Canny Conversations, but I also hold a non-executive director role with the NHS for Gloucestershire Hospitals, which is one of the biggest hospitals foundation trusts in the country, and that takes up about a day a week of my time, and the rest of my time I spend with clients, either on a one-to-one or a team basis. My background, as I might have worked with some of you before in the past from an energy point of view, I was on the board at Ecotricity for 5 years, and then I was one of the founding team who set up Bristol Energy back in 2017, and I spent a long time in financial services before that. So lots of industries where you're having difficult conversations, lots of job roles where you're having difficult conversations an awful lot of the time. So I have 2 beliefs that give me the basis for the work that I now do. And the first one is that dealing with people is probably the biggest problem that you face. And my only caveat to Dale Carnegie's quote was I would remove the word probably, and I would say that dealing with people is absolutely, in my experience, often the biggest problem that you're facing when you're trying to do your job and you're trying to navigate life in general. My second belief is that most challenges can be overcome by better quality communication. So those 2 things together for me are the key to improving business performance, improving individual performance, and improving the relationships that you have with the people around you. So the problem that we have, the problem that I'm going to start to address and try and solve for you, is that when you've got conflict, when you've got any kind of confusion or friction, what it produces is a space where your energy gets redirected onto unproductive things. We all know how it feels, where you're feeling uncomfortable, you're feeling frustrated, you're either chewing it over yourself, or you're chewing it over with your mates, or you're talking to other people about it. And all of that time and all of that energy could be spent on something much more productive. And if you run a team, you'll see this yourselves. When the team is feeling frustrated, or when the team is feeling conflict, then all of a sudden you have a big chunk of productive energy and productive time being spent on unproductive stuff. So what I'm trying to help you with is that thing that actually, if we can be really clear about what we want to say, and we can be upfront about what we want to say, then the benefits will be not just the wasted time and not just the improved energy, but the improved relationships, but also that redirection of your energy onto productive work, which is what all of us want to do. We just want to improve productivity in our businesses. So I'm going to start with the definition of a difficult conversation, because we all have what I would call disagreements all day, every day. And minor disagreements, we don't even notice, they just happen. They're just part of disagreeing with people around us. The difference between a disagreement and a difficult conversation is that bit in the middle. It's when you bring in the feelings and the emotions. So say I want to meet with you on a Tuesday and you want to meet with me on a Thursday, and it's very black and white and it's diary related and logistics. That's just a disagreement. As soon as we add in some kind of feelings or emotions, so I might think, oh my God, you always suggest a Thursday. You know I can't do a Thursday. You know a Thursday is really difficult for me. You know, historically, you just disagree with me on principle. All of a sudden, that conversation becomes much more difficult because now there are some feelings or some emotions involved. And what's really interesting about a difficult conversation is that I might think it's really straightforward. and I might have no emotions involved at all, whereas you might be bringing a whole bag full of emotions with you into the topic of conversation, and vice versa. So we might both think it's going to be straightforward. One of us might think it's going to be straightforward. Neither of us think it's going to be straightforward. So all of those things together make it really difficult for us to work out, what am I walking into today? Is it going to be straightforward, or are there going to be emotions involved? And as soon as you've got those, what I'm calling high stakes, that's when the dynamic changes. So that might be my ego's at stake. It might be my reputation that's at stake. It might be something bigger, like a promotion or a project that I want to work on, but something is at stake because we've involved those feelings and those emotions. There's 3 reasons why it feels so awkward. We all know how that feels. We all know how it physically feels to us when we're about to go into that conversation, or somebody's about to have that type of conversation with us. So the first one is the physical discomfort. So we get the pounding heart, we get our breathing speeds up, the blood starts to go to your limbs and the muscles tighten. So we know that we physically start to feel awkward. And unfortunately, that's because our body can't work out the difference between a threat to our ego and an actual physical threat of a saber-toothed tiger coming to attack us. And we genuinely go into the fight or the fright or the freeze mechanism that comes with a physical threat, even though it's an academic threat that we're feeling. So knowing why it feels awkward helps us to adjust. It helps us to just slow our own breathing down. It helps us just to take a pause and take a moment for us to feel better, because we know why it's happening to us. The second thing is the speed of emotional response. So if I come in and I start telling you something that you perceive as bad news, your emotional mind will jump to, this is threatening something, this is threatening a project I was working on, it's threatening my job role that I was doing, it's threatening my reputation. And your emotional mind works something like 4 or 5 times quicker than your rational mind. So your reaction will be emotional. And I might respond emotionally to you, and therefore my response might be unpredictable. And that kind of just adds to the awkwardness of the conversation. So understanding that people's first kind of in the heat of the moment response isn't necessarily their rational response enables you to be calm and to take the higher ground and just to wait till their rational brain kicks in. And we've all been in a situation where someone will go, oh my God, that's ridiculous. And almost within minutes, they could be saying, well, okay, I don't like it, but I can see where you're coming from, rather than that immediate gut feel. So that's kind of where that response comes from. And the third thing is that there are often, if not always, several versions of the truth. So you go into a conversation with somebody and you have a different version of the truth than they do. And that adds to that awkward feel, because you might either feel that they're lying, or you might feel that they're accusing you of lying, and that just adds to the complexity. Whereas if we understand that there are different versions of the truth, then again, that helps us address those conversations. So we each have access to different bits of information. We all interpret those bits of information in different ways. And also we can't help but come to a conclusion that reflects our self-interest. So we are the heroes of our own story. Our egos cannot help but be right in the middle. So we'll remember things that make us look more favorable than we might have been in reality. And we can't help that. But having that awareness that I'm going to remember the version of events that makes me look good, and you're going to remember the version that makes you look good, will help me understand why the versions of our truth might look slightly different. And another really nice theory, I've got a book here that if anybody's interested in reading, Fierce Conversations, and Susan Scott talks about beach ball reality, and she talks about the fact that we see from the stripe that we stand on. So your finance director might stand on the blue stripe, and when you ask them a question about a particular situation, they'll look down, they'll be like, yeah, it's blue. And I'm going to come at this from my financial perspective. But the same scenario, the same project, the same theory, your marketing director might be standing on the red stripe, and they look down and say, yeah, it's all red, and they're looking at it from a marketing point of view, which doesn't mean that either version is wrong. It's just a different version of the truth. So if you feel like you need to have a difficult conversation, I would advise a little bit of caution and a little bit of a sense check before you launch in. So your first one would be to think about your own motivations. Is there a positive reason for me to raise this? What am I hoping to get out of it? What's my motivation? Think through what the possible solutions might be. So rather than addressing a problem with you, it's much more sensible, it's much more rational if I've thought through a few different options of how we could take it forward that might be different. If I understand the worst case scenario in terms of your reaction, then I am going to be better prepared. So if I think that you might shout and scream and stamp your feet, then I need to prepare for that. And am I ready to cope with that? And that comes down to the risks. If I think there's a risk that you're going to fall out with me and that you're going to hold it against me for a length of time, I might decide that the risk isn't worth taking and that our relationship isn't worth risking for the sake of the conversation I need to have. And I might decide to go away and give it a little bit more thought. It's really important to think about where you are, how you're going to have those conversations, who else is going to be around when you have them, if you're thinking that's something that you want to do. And if you're really umming and ahhing, I would really recommend asking advice, particularly from somebody who knows both of you. So they're going to be able to tell you whether you're making a mountain out of a molehill or whether it's something that they think you should address, and they might give you some advice as to how you could, how would be best to broach it. If it's an issue that you think there's going to be a little bit of he said, she said, or us and them, really think about what your contribution is. Is it purely black and white? Is it all them and you've done nothing? Or could you have done something differently? Could you have contributed, even if it's 5%, could you have contributed in a different way to the outcome that you want to talk to them about? And that often helps to kind of balance out your thoughts as you go in and kind of reduce that emotional feeling. That whole kind of people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Be really careful when you're going into something, particularly if you're giving somebody some negative feedback, that you're okay from your side of the street. That you don't want to start off with well, you're going to say that, but I've seen you do it before. You're going to get very quickly into those things, and being prepared. The kind of, if there's one thing you take away from this today, I would take away the kind of being prepared and thinking it through. There are going to be aspects that you can't control, but often with things that are out of your control, you have the potential to be able to influence. So their focus and their environment and their time, again, it's that whole thing as I need to talk to you, is now a convenient time for you? I think it will take about 10 minutes. Have you got 10 minutes? Is that okay? Those things around managing people's expectations will always help to try and ensure that they're focused on what you've got to say. You obviously can't control their reactions, but again, you could manage expectations. If I'm asking you to come and have a quick chat with me, I might decide to say, can I have a quick chat? You know, just need to pop just the two of us. And I don't think you're going to like what I've got to say, but I'd rather just say it. Straight away, I'm making sure that I'm enabling you to know what you're going into. You're not going to start talking about your weekend and be caught off guard, but you're going to help you mentally prepare yourself for a couple of seconds before we sit down so that you're not taken over too much by your emotional reaction. And you might want to think through the possible types of reactions that you might get. So often when we go in and we're giving somebody negative feedback or telling somebody bad news, you often get these four that I've put up here. So you've got anger, you've got confusion, distress, and negotiation. It's thinking through, what do I think I might get? And am I prepared enough to cope with that? So if somebody's going to be angry, am I ready to stay calm and to understand that I need to be responding in a calm and a quiet way because I'm going to help diffuse that anger? If someone's going to be confused and not really understand what I'm telling them and get a bit overwhelmed, am I prepared to be patient? Have I got time to be patient? Have I got time to repeat the key bits of information and check their understanding? If I think somebody might get upset, have I got time for that pause? And I talk to people about planning in the pause in terms of really helping somebody. I'm upset with this. I can't listen to what you're saying. Okay, go and grab a glass of water. We'll continue this conversation in half an hour if you're able to. That having that pause in, being sensitive and calm and understanding, and knowing if you think they're likely to come back and negotiate. So if you're saying you want to have the meeting on a Tuesday and they're saying they want to have it on Thursday, are they going to come back and say, well, how about we do it every other week? And are you prepared for that? Or are you prepared to be direct and firm? Because again, it will help from a clarity point of view if you've already determined that in your mind before you start. There's a model called the BOF model that some of you might have heard of before, and it's really, really simple and it's really easy to remember, and it helps you structure a conversation so that you're not just what I would call admiring the problem and going around in circles, but actually starting to move things forward. And it starts off with the behaviour, outcome, feelings, and future. So if I give you a really quick example, so say it's really black and white situation. So we have meetings on a weekly basis and you're always late. You're always 5 minutes late. And being late once isn't a big issue, but being consistently late is getting really quite irritating. So I might have a quick chat with you and say, look, Doris, every single weekly meeting we have, you're 5 minutes late. The impact that's having on other people is that they were all sitting waiting for you. Sometimes we start the meeting and then we have to repeat ourselves when you join us, and it's all a bit awkward and it's wasting people's time. It's making people get quite frustrated, and it's quite annoying for me because I hear people say negative things about you that I think you would be appalled at if you knew. What I'd really like is for you to stay, to keep to time if you can, and if you can't be there on time, just let somebody know beforehand. So straight away I've used the 4 steps of the model to be really clear about the issue, but to get straight to how do I want it to work going forward. If it's more complicated, so I've heard that you've done something from somebody else, then I would do what I would call the 2-way version, which is exactly the same as the 1-way version. I'm just adding in some questions. So I've heard from Doris that you've been smoking with Fred outside and you're not meant to be smoking in that area. Is that the case? So I'm not going to launch straight into telling you what, because I don't know what the situation is. So it's that kind of, is that the case? You know, this is what I think the impact of that behavior is, but what do you think? This is how it's making me feel. How is it making you feel? How do you feel now that we're having this conversation? And what do you think we should do going forward? So it then lends itself really nicely to a 2-way, very calm, very rational conversation about the different options that we've got ahead of us. And the final thing I wanted to touch on before I give you a bit of a question to think about is being on the receiving end of a difficult conversation. So what I've talked about all the way up till now are these conversations that are burning, that you want to be having and you want to plan for or prepare for, but we're all in situations where we're the ones that's being called to one side, or we're the ones that are saying, look, Elaine, have you got 10 minutes? And I want you to think about how it feels to be on the receiving end of that, and how you can behave differently to get a really successful interaction and a successful outcome as you can. And the big thing for me is, if you are on the receiving end, you are in control about which way this conversation will go. So people often talk about, well, I'm on the back foot. If I'm on the receiving end, I'd rather be the one in control. The reality is you are the one who has the choice. If you're going to shout and scream and stamp your feet and burst into tears, that conversation will go a certain direction. If you ask rational questions and you're calm and you're trying to listen and you're asking if you can have some time to think it through, the conversation is going to go in a very different way. And if you think about certainly the conversations that you have in the workplace about how professional you want to be and how reasonable you want to be, I know which of those 2 people I would want to be perceived as with my peers, with the people around me. So really think about how you are when it's on the receiving end. So if I give you the example of you receiving some negative feedback, you'd say you're the one that's always 5 minutes late. You're the one that's been smoking behind the bike sheds. You're the one that's made a mistake with a particular project. And I want you to think about how you react. My advice is always to bite your tongue and listen. Your instinct, my instinct, everyone's instinct is to launch straight in. Well, I know what you're going to say, and I already know the answer, and I know the excuse, and I know the reason, I'm going to go straight in. If you bite your tongue and you listen, then straight away you have approached it differently. You can take the high ground. I'm just going to listen. Be accountable. Ask questions. Well, who saw me do this? And when did that happen? And was that really the outcome? Start to ask the questions around the clarity. Don't start to have the argument. And my final recommendation on this front is always to take it away to think about and come back if you can. Now, that's not always the situation. Somebody might be asking you for a response immediately, but if you can say, yep, okay, I've heard what you've got to say, I'm just going to give it some thought if that's okay and come back to you, then you are going to give yourself time to cope with that initial emotional reaction and hopefully be able to come back with a more rational one. If you're able to give it what I would call the overnight test, take that opportunity. Again, you can't always do that. You might just be able to take 10 minutes, but really think through, was it fair that they had to say? And if it wasn't fair, was any of it fair? So the bigger picture might not be, but this little bit, yeah, they were right, I did do that. Is that fair? If they've given you bad news, what are your questions? What are your concerns? And the biggie is, do you need to have another conversation? And if you do, what kind of conversation does that need to be? And all of a sudden, you're now in control of planning for that second conversation because you're not on the back foot anymore. So you can then think through, what's the outcome I want to see? How am I feeling about this? What are my questions? What are my concerns? And how do I think we need to take this forward in the future? so you then can plan for that conversation. And if you think about all the people you've ever had to give negative feedback to, and if they'd had some training on how to be on the receiving end, if you think about how much more successful those interactions would have been, then that's how you want others to feel when they know, actually, I can raise this, because I know that they'll listen. They might not agree with me, and they might come back with a million and one reasons why we should do it differently, but I know that they will listen, and I know they will react in a professional manner. And that's the kind of people that you want to be talking to, so you're role modeling those behaviors yourself. So what I'd really like to do, if we can, is to go into some breakout groups. I've got a question for you, and I want you to really think about, what excuses do you use to avoid the difficult conversations? Or if you don't avoid them, you must work with somebody who avoids them. So think about the excuses that other people use to avoid the difficult conversations, and what would really help you to remove those excuses.
I'm going to add those questions into the chat as well, because when we go to the breakout rooms, you won't be able to see them on the screen. So you should be able to see them in the chat function if you haven't managed to quickly write them down whilst Elaine was talking that. Okay, so breakout rooms. Here we go. Starting now. If you haven't been into a breakout room, in the moment it's going to ask you to select a new room. If you just say yes, it's going to pop you into a room with a group of other people where you can have a lovely conversation. You'll only be able to hear and see the people in the room whose room you're in, and other rooms won't be able to hear or see you at all. So here we go.
How long have we got, Hayley?
About 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Fucking hell, come on. Mm.
Hi, we're back.
Excellent. Yeah, everyone's just starting to hop back in now.
Yeah. How long have we got, Hayley?
We've literally got a few minutes for any sort of Q&A and wrap up.
Okay.
Looks like we have everybody back, Elaine.
Brilliant. So I hope you found that discussion helpful in terms of a little bit of a chat about why you avoid difficult conversations if you do so, and how you could remove those barriers. What was interesting in the group that I was in, we talked about how you can transfer quite a lot of these hints and tips to email. So almost that pause that you have when you're thinking about my response, can I be more rational about my response? It's the same as that email where you write that angry email, and before you press send, you just pause for a little, and you might go for a bit of a walk, or you might give yourself half an hour and come back and read it before you press send. I think is really important. Has anyone got any particular questions they'd like to ask before I wrap up?
I've got a couple of questions that were in my... Oh, there, go on, Karen, you've unmuted yourself. Go on, you go, Karen, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask how this works. Obviously, at the moment, a lot of people are working from home, so we're all remotely working. And when trying to have a conversation, it's very easy at the moment to drop out of a difficult conversation along the lines of, oh, look, I've lost my connection, my thing's gone, I can't connect to the internet, something. It's very easy to get out of that. So how do we avoid those kind of situations where we know that we're being avoided so that we're not having the conversation, but how do we resolve it when we're unable to grab the person at the coffee machine or in the lift or on the way through the door?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Karen. It almost becomes more of a big deal, doesn't it? Because we have to kind of book in a slot to talk to somebody when we might have just grabbed them or engineered a bumping into them situation. Again, I would have that whole thing about is it worth it? So if I'm having to say to them, look, I really need to speak to you, can we schedule some time to chat? Because we know it's going to be a phone call or a video call, it needs to be more scheduled. So there's that difference in terms of weighing up how important it is. But it is that thing of, I really need to talk to you. I don't think it will take more than 10 minutes. Can you let me know when will be most convenient for you, either in terms of having the time or having the space to find a quiet moment, or having the opportunity to make sure that your internet connection works, or actually if the internet connection doesn't work, maybe we'll have a phone call instead. You are having to just work that little bit harder, I think, at the moment. In having those conversations, and I typically would say, yeah, no problem, are you going to give me any clues of what it's about? Because I would want to know. So again, it's being prepared. Am I prepared to say what it's about? Can I give somebody, we rarely want to catch people out, do we? And so kind of, no, it's not a big deal, I just got something I want to run past you. But you are having to plan for those things if you think they are going to try and duck out of it. or not have it. My biggest piece of advice would be to just not have it on email, email being an absolute last resort. If you can, even if it's a phone conversation or an internet conversation that has to be put off for a couple of days, is still going to be better than an email conversation. Anything else?
Yeah, I've got a question, may not be able to help, but I've previously had a manager who always shied away from a difficult conversation, even when you try to explain to them how they need to have the conversation with someone. Is there any ways you know of that, how you could encourage someone to do that?
I would ask the questions. I think questions are a really, really good technique in this instance, in terms of you're really keen that they have the conversation, but it's kind of up to them whether they have it or not. It's then that question around why would they not want to? How are they going to deal with it differently? Do they not think it's an issue that you've got? And maybe almost addressing it in that same way with the BOF model. So the behavior might be, you're not addressing this conversation, the outcome or the impact might be that the problem isn't going to go away, and it's actually just going to get worse the longer we leave it. You're feeling, from a feelings point of view, you might be feeling quite frustrated. In an ideal world, you'd really like that to have that you'd like them to have that conversation, but what do they think is the better next step to go forward? And that in itself, using the BOF model to have that conversation, to have a difficult conversation about a difficult can almost help you understand them, because they might be putting it off because they're not confident, or they're not willing to take the risk of what the fallout might look like. But actually, between the two of you, you might be able to come up with a third option or a fourth option that might get you somewhere down the line, if they really don't want to have that conversation. It's difficult when it's at a different hierarchy, or maybe for you to structure that might help.
Yeah, that's good, thanks.
We got time for another question, anybody? No, I'm going to quickly give you my 12 tips then, and then I'll
Whilst you're doing that, can I run the poll?
yeah, go for it.
There we go. So it's the same question again, but confidence levels have changed, Elaine.
Good. So I'm going to just quickly run through 12 steps for you, which just kind of summarizes everything I've covered today. So my first step is around using a framework to help you plan. So whether the BOF model works for you, or you've got a framework that you use yourself, anything that can help you plan, even if it's just for 30 seconds before you walk into a conversation, will increase the likelihood of success. Really putting yourself in their shoes. Why do you think they're doing what they're doing? Why would a rational person take the action that they're taking? Is it just a silly mistake? Have they not had enough training or enough support? Think about how and the where, and what the surroundings might look like, and particularly as we've just touched on, the fact that it might need to be a video call, it might need to be a phone call. Be really clear about what you're saying. We're really rubbish as British people for dancing around our handbags and not just saying what we mean. And ambiguity can absolutely kill one of these conversations, and they go away thinking, oh, that was really good. And you think, oh, did I get my point across? If you explore motivation, if it looks like there's only an A or a B, really try and understand and ask questions around motivation. There might be a third option that gets you both what you want. Being prepared for the emotional reaction will help, and how will you behave if they are angry or if they are upset, but also be aware of your own emotional reaction. Try not to get defensive, try and keep your own barriers down. Be authentic, be you. Don't try and behave in a way that isn't you, because you will lose credibility. And spend the time in the conversation asking questions, rather than being accusatory. If you can question your assumptions and question your understanding, you'll have a much more conversation. Listen really carefully to what other people are saying, and that will help with questioning your assumptions. And always plan for that pause. Do I need to take a break? Do they need to take a break? Is there any harm in us reconvening later on? but always agreeing what the next steps are in terms of who's going to do what next and how we're going to keep track. And my final bit for you is just an offer for a complimentary consultation. So either a conversation with you, it might be a particular issue you're having, or it might be talking about how you support your teams better to have better quality conversations. But in either of those instances, if you wanted to take the offer up, then do just drop me an email. And thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Angela, you're on mute. I can see you talking.
You can tell I'm an expert in Zoom, that's why Hayley's here. Yeah, sorry, thank you. I'm saying thank you, Elaine, for that. That was amazing. And I don't know about anybody else. I was in the room with Tracy and Karen. It was a really interesting conversation. And there was lots of things. We could have gone on and asked lots of different questions, but we're obviously limited with time. And thank you so much for offering for the 30 minutes. I'm sure a lot of the girls will take you up on that. And Helen, I know we'll be sending across the, you've got a handout to give them with the 12 recommended steps and also your contact details for do that. So thank you very much. Now, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, and next week we'll be joined by Angela Booth from Thames Water. So recently we've talked a lot about the impact of COVID on the energy market, haven't we? And you know what a difference it's made to not just generation but balancing, etc., etc. Well, next week Angela's going to be telling us all about what the impact has been on the water industry. So look forward to that. And I think as lockdown starts to ease, I think less people now working at home and moving more towards working towards the working in the office. Sorry, and so I think next week will be our last weekly one for all, and we'll start and do them monthly. But what that means is that they'll be a little bit longer, and so we might maybe have 2 weeks. I don't know, I haven't worked it out yet, but I think we'll move from monthly. So next week will be our last weekly one when we have Angela, and then after that we'll move on to monthly. And I do hope you'll all still join us. It'll be lovely to all to still see your faces. At the minute, Hayley and I are looking at some new software where it's proper networking software, where everybody sits around tables, as if you're at a networking event. So we don't know whether it'll work or not. So fingers crossed if it does, it might be more like, instead of being Zoom, where people can change tables and talk to each other. And so keep your eye on our LinkedIn posts. And I can see we've got quite a few of our applications for advocates on here. Thank you so much for applying. I'll be in touch very soon about next steps. And those ladies will be helping us ensure that one continues to thrive as it is now. Just once again, I'd like to thank Elaine. That was great, Elaine. Seriously, I think I can tell by everybody's face they got a lot out of that. Yeah, I've got lots of smiles. So thank you very much. How did we do on the poll, Hayley?
It was everybody had moved up into confident or very confident, those top 2 ones there. I don't know if I could. Here we go. You can see. So very or fairly.
Have we got some thumbs up, ladies? Have we got thumbs up? Did we enjoy that? Great. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So hopefully we'll see you next week. Have I forgotten anything, Hayley?
No, not this week.
It's scriptless this week, so it just goes to show when I haven't got a script, I do it all. Okay, everybody, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.